Can you tell us about these books that you've done?
Yeah, so we can start with the first one, which is called Slovakia, the Legend of the Linden. This was an incredibly big endeavor. It's 210 pages, very vividly illustrated with vivid imagery, photographs that kind of thematically go with the text. We did this for two reasons. Again, people are not consuming literature in the traditional way, and we wanted to anchor the knowledge in both hemispheres of their brain, on the left and the right brain. So we felt that it was very potent to not just put out a book of images, which is actually a very popular format of communicating Slovakia, just through imagery.
Yeah, there's lots of books like Slovakia, and it's got the tatras and cities and stuff like that.
Yeah. And another way that we've seen Slovakia story communicated is more in a historical, factual way, so you'll just have a whole lot of text.
I've tried to read some of those with minimal success.
Yeah, they're very challenging reads, also for native speakers. So we wanted to find kind of a light way to combine both imagery and words together. And this story we refer to as the first national narrative of the country. So it's a story that captures the historical signposts that Slovakia has gone through from 500 years before Christ all the way up to the 21st century. We capture this narrative using symbolism and emotion, and the symbol that we exalted to tell this tale is the linden tree and its heart-shaped linden leaf, which is actually the totem of Slovakia, or unofficial totem of Slovakia. Although it's a symbol we see on our passports, on our identity cards, on our state ministries, on national monuments, on national documents, but also on the state seal. So it is literally a symbol or a code that has been following us at every step of our sovereign journey ever since.
You're saying this, and I'm like, really? It is? I don't think I've even really noticed it that much.
Yeah, so we have a whole section in the book where we refer to it as hidden in plain sight. So it's a motif that follows us, kind of like the Canadian maple leaf.
Right.
But it's just not talked about, so it's not in our conscious awareness.
Right. Yeah, I've tried to read some histories of Slovakia because I do find history fascinating, but they were just so boring every time I went to read them. I would just kind of start nodding. It gets cure for insomnia. It would get really into details that I wasn't. I'm interested in, of course, like culture and things happening and events, but it would get really into the minutiae of like the codification of the language, which I just not. I mean, I speak some Slovak, but I don't know the grammar that well that I'm worried about who did I's and Y's and that was, yeah. So I'm interested.
So that's actually a reflection of the way history is taught in this region, or things. Slovaks like to go into really, really minute detail, and that's fantastic if you want to map every little crumb. But often when you do that, you miss the plot. Like, you miss the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
And that's what's really missing, is a kind of essential way of communicating Slovakia's journey, or key things, just like in snapshots, rather than, in the tiniest, most minute little dots.
Yeah. And your other book?
Yes. Away. So the other book is very different. It's also very visual. It's about 300 pages. It has 58 incredible portraits. I'm going to show you some of them. It's about Slovakia's journey in the 21st century. And we're telling this tale through freedom of movement, which is a great liberty that Slovaks gained when they sent it to the European Union in 2004, 15 years ago, which may not seem like a big deal for Canadians and Americans who are kind of free to move wherever they want, but we need to always understand the context of the region. Slovakia was behind the Iron Curtain for 4 decades. So, for example, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, they couldn't move. They couldn't geographically leave the Eastern Bloc, and that had huge kind of imprints on their psyche and their knowledge development. So the liberalization of movement, freedom of movement, was a really, really big deal, and I kind of wanted to celebrate it, which is why I wrote this book. It actually builds on my doctorate research that I did in the UK, and it honors the journeys of returnees. So those are Slovaks young Slovaks that went abroad to live, work, or study somewhere in Western Europe, and have since come back to anchor their knowledge back into Slovakia so that they can help to shift the culture further up from there.
Was there a common thread throughout the stories?
Yeah, there are many common threads. One of them was the fact that these Slovaks that are featured in this book, said their mindset changed, or their way of perceiving reality changed when they left Slovakia. And that's really normal, because often when you're raised in one place and there's not a lot of, let's say, cultural diversity in Slovakia, it's a pretty monocultural country. You don't have access to a lot of pluralistic perspectives, unlike in Canada and Vancouver, where you go to school with classmates from a lot of different nationalities, from a lot of different religious backgrounds. You don't have that in Slovakia. So the way you're raised here is like your perception of reality is not really challenged. Everyone thinks like you do. And all of a sudden when you move to London, that perception is radically challenged, not only because of the cultural diversity that's in that city, but also Brits have a very different way of approaching topics like individualism, like capitalism. So that confrontation was a big room opportunity for growth for these people.
And what book are you on? What's your next project? What project are you working on now?
So thank you so much for asking. Our third project, which is almost finished, is due to come out at the end of November of this year, so in 2019. It's called Czechoslovakia Behind the Iron Curtain, and that's actually our most ambitious project yet. It's about 600 pages, so we've doubled in word count, and it tells Slovakia's story behind the Iron Curtain, so the 4 decades that it was part of the Soviet bloc. And once again, we use a lot of visual imagery to match the writing sections. We have over 100 illustrations and photographs. We worked with some of the best photographers of the era, both Czech and Slovak, that kind of bring those memories to life. But we also worked with a fascinating team of international illustrators that did 5 illustrations each, again to capture some of the humorous side, some of the painful side, some of the architecture of the era.
Yeah, I find that era really fascinating because it's an area in which people who lived up through that are still living, and yet I can't. Coming from Canada, it's just such a foreign way to live. Like I can't. The stories I hear, I just kind of like it. It fascinates me how people lived in a time like that, and the things that were often the kind of helplessness, or not helplessness, but for example, my oldest brother-in-law, he was part of the Candlelit manifestation, and he got beat up by the police and all that, and what can you do? Nothing. Like there's no justice to you're upset and you're angry that this happened and it's not fair, and there's nothing you can do about it. And it's a really fascinating part of history.
That's what we wanted to codify. It's also so that the younger generation, which doesn't have experience with this, is able to consume that history and to better understand it, so that this history is never repeated again. That is exactly what the regime cultivated, which was a sense of powerlessness in the population. Because if you cultivate that, if you make people feel like no matter what they do, whatever effort they exert is futile, the same people will be able to stay in power, and that was also what the whole premise behind communism was, this totalitarian control. You had the central authority that decided everything for the people. In fact, there was no individual. It was all about the collective. So just operating within that belief system is so disempowering, because you as alone, as a single unit, are kind of irrelevant.
When you were talking right now, I just connected some dots, and I was like, yeah, a lot of things just made sense right now.
Yeah, and so when you read the book, or when people read the book, this is exactly what we're hoping will be the effect. They will be able to connect the dots, because that's kind of what we did, and we just feel like it's really important to get this book out, to get this book also into schools, but also not just schools in Slovakia, but also abroad, so they can learn from the Czechoslovak experiment with communism.
Yeah, I mean, even between my children's experience of Slovakia and my husband's experience of Slovakia, there's such a huge difference. And it is, there are visible reminders, communist architecture and stuff, but I think Slovaks themselves aren't even aware of the ramifications of how that era still influences today, not just physically, but in the mentality of the people, in the mindset of Slovaks today.
Yeah, so it's when you go through trauma, as I think communism did traumatize the population, and that population went through some trauma even before the regime was imposed on them in 1948. They went through the Second World War, which was pretty dramatic too. The Nazis were here. There was a lot of slaughtering that was happening, and then the communists came. There was more slaughter. So it's hard to kind of be able to map your own trauma. Sometimes it takes an outsider perspective to be able to see some of these dysfunctional behavioral patterns or kind of mindset habits that are a result of this. And I think the younger generation actually has insight to say that, because they do think differently.